and welcome to the Cold War Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Gabriel Lim. When the world was the closest it had ever been to nuclear annihilation, with every decision potentially triggering a chain reaction of destruction, the USA and the Soviet Union sat across from each other, not to escalate conflict, but to limit it. Of course, this episode I'll be talking about Detente and the historic Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or the SALT treaties, and how they sparked the start and the end of eased tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. For those unaware, Detente was a period of the Cold War that took place from 1967 to 1979. It marked the easing of tensions between the USA and the Soviet Union. But why were these tensions so high in the first place? We'll get into that in our first segment. Part 1: Understanding the tension. Before Detente, tensions between the USA and the USSR were at an all-time high. We know that the ideological differences of capitalism versus communism were the driving factor behind the start of the Cold War, but as we entered the 1950s and 60s, more and more complex factors such as espionage, propaganda, proxy wars, and the space race further deepened the divide between the two superpowers. Most importantly, though, at the core of these tensions was the nuclear arms race, a terrifying buildup of weapons capable of mutually assured destruction, meaning if one country were to fire first, the other would respond accordingly, wiping out both countries. Tensions peaked in October of 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, with both the USA and USSR pointing active nuclear missiles at each other before an agreement was reached to step down. We also saw the anti war sentiment rise in the American people during the mid 1960s, further increasing the view that both sides should disengage from conflict. Clearly, things needed to change. Détente emerged as a way to avoid this threat, leading both superpowers to seek to limit the arms race and avoid nuclear conflict. Jumping to 1969, the election of Richard Nixon further promised to decrease tensions, with both bringing back troops from Vietnam and improving relations with the USSR being a part of his campaign, leading us on to the next part of this episode. Part 2: The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 1. The discussion for the SALT Treaty between Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev took place in Helsinki, Finland in 1969. Though there were initial disagreements, in a summary meeting in Moscow, after 2.5 years of negotiation, the first round of the talks were brought to a conclusion on May 26, 1972, when President Nixon and General Secretary Brezhnev signed the ABM Treaty and the Interim Agreement on Strategic Offensive Arms. The ABM Treaty held importance as it limited the number of anti-ballistic missiles both sides could have, therefore reducing the need to build more or new offensive weapons to overcome any defenses that the other might deploy. Additionally, the interim agreement held importance as it limited the number of strategic offensive missiles each side could deploy for 5 years. Now, what were the motives for signing this treaty? Well, under Nixon's government and Brezhnev's government, the USA and the USSR ratified this treaty for a number of shared reasons, one of which was obviously to reduce the risk of nuclear war, evident in the ABM and interim treaties. Another reason was also the economic strain on both countries that the arms race was causing. By limiting the need for missiles and warheads, both countries could focus on redirecting resources to other areas of their respective economies. Additionally, Nixon and Brezhnev's ratification of the treaty could be seen as a way to garner domestic support. For Nixon, who was not even a year into his term, it provided his reputation as a diplomat who promised to reshape American foreign policy, giving a temporary answer to the anti war protests. And for Brezhnev, it portrayed him as a leader committed to avoiding nuclear war and securing the future of global communism through diplomacy. Part 3: Détente in Full Swing and SALT II. Following the 1972 treaty, the period of détente was in full motion, marked by increased trade and diplomatic engagement between both countries. Both the US and USSR cooperated on several international issues and held regular summits. However, this period was delicate and tensions remained in other aspects, such as proxy wars around the globe. Throughout this period, talks were held for SALT II in 1972, 1974, and 78, with the primary goal of the treaty being to replace the interim agreement with a long term, comprehensive treaty. On June 18, 1979, new US President Jimmy Carter and General Secretary Brezhnev signed SALT II in Vienna. However, on January 3, 1980, President Carter requested the Senate to delay consideration of the treaty in view of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Seen as aggressive expansionism of communism by the US, as well as its geographical significance near the oil-rich Persian Gulf, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan led to the shattering of the already fragile Detente, leading to the rapid deterioration of US-Soviet relations. The non-ratification of SALT II sent a clear message to the Soviet Union that the US was no longer willing to cooperate with them, effectively ending the near decade-long peace between the two countries and reigniting the Cold War. Part 4: The Legacy of the SALT Treaties. So what was the legacy of Detente and the SALT Treaties? These treaties represented a critical moment in history, a moment when diplomacy, not destruction, took center stage. Looking back, the success of the SALT I talks demonstrated the effectiveness of communication between global superpowers, especially during tense times. Additionally, the SALT treaties gave way to the 1991 START and the 2010 New START treaties, which are still effective today, representing how crucial the relationship between the USA and USSR was during Dayton. Though the SALT treaties didn't end the Cold War, they proved that the superpowers could compromise and step back from the brink of war. And for that, Détente remains a powerful reminder of the importance of diplomacy in an uncertain world. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Cold War Chronicles.